What's going on, everybody? It is us, the Vanishing Mediators, and we are here for a very special episode. I watched the documentary. I'm all the worse for it because of the characters shown in this documentary. It's called Into the Manosphere, Louis Theroux, Into the Manosphere. And I recommended it to my partner in crime here, Andrew, and we decided to make this emergency broadcast to talk about this documentary because I felt like, there were many portals here for discussion and some of the, characters that were displayed, some of the ideology that was thrown around between Louis and the Manosphere influencers who are featured in this documentary. And I want to approach this not just as an exercise in pointing out the obvious about what's wrong with the Manosphere. And I don't want to repeat what's said in the documentary from the point of view of Louis so much as I would like to talk about the the dynamic that exists between Louis Theroux, the documentarian, his mild critiques of this manosphere ideology, and then the manosphere ideology and why people are drawn to it. But we're not making this documentary. We're not making this episode just because we watched this documentary and found it intriguing, but also because I'm thinking of this as kind of like an appetizer to our upcoming episode on Seminar 4. And it also ties into some of the readings that I've been doing on and by Althusser and ideology. And I just thought there was a lot to pick apart in this documentary. And if you haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. Go watch it now and then come back to this episode. Or, you know what? Don't watch it at all and just listen to us talk about it. But at any rate, there were three main topics, three main thematics that I kind of wanted to address here. One, I'd like to talk about the logic of sexuation, but more so in connection with early Lacan, the Lacan of Seminar 4. We're about to read Seminar 4. We are reading Seminar 4. We're about to make some episodes about it. So, sexuation, the phallus, desire of the mother, some Lacanian themes that I think can help explain or at least illuminate what's going on with these manosphere bros and their double standards surrounding their feelings about women and their mothers and sexuality and being a man, masculinity, all that shit. Two, I wanted to talk about, you know, why so many young men are drawn towards these manosphere influencers and kind of break that down within a sort of, Marxist framework. Right now I'm reading Althusser, so that's going to color my analysis. And three, I would like to talk about some of the conclusions that Louis Theroux draws in this documentary and how his response to what is blatantly abhorrent in the manosphere ideology is also insufficient, that you can't really stand it up against what these guys have to say because, well, it isn't really an argument against it. I mean, it is, but it isn't a strong argument. So, in a sense, I think it would be interesting for us to, you know, maybe argue against some of these manosphere premises that characterize, the ideology, but kind of like from within it, instead of presenting a sort of bland liberal bourgeois humanism as the alternative to being a manosphere guy. Anyway, that was a lot, but how about if you're on board, we tackle the Lacanian stuff out the
Yeah,
gate? What do you think?
yeah, I think that's perfect. And I think going by one, especially with the first point about how the logic of this manosphere could world fits perfectly within not only the fantasy of there being a sexual relationship, and there being the one who is supposed to be the man who has it all and enjoys, but that it fits perfectly in the Lacanian formula of sexuation, and also juxtaposing it because I know you mentioned Seminar Four. I've read more of 20. I know some of the stuff in the later years you're not as familiar with, but I think it's a good back and forth that we could complement each other with. Um, because I think that first part of your argument is definitely going to be Lacanian heavy. I think the second aspect of your argument, which is like what about these people attract so many followers? In my mind, I know you mentioned Althusserian ideology. In my mind, I would like to also incorporate my reading from Freud's group psychology, the myth of the primal horde, which again will spring off of the formulas for sexuation, and what Rosichner has to say regarding paternalistic identification, which I think this is also a form of. And even with this like status of like the fall of like masculinity or masculinity somehow being taken away by some external threat, which are the feminists and the woke agenda, etc., as almost somehow like a form of paranoia, which seems to also fall into like what we could see in late Lacan as like the decline of the paternal function as such. So there's no the name of the father, but only a name of the father, which makes the law only a sort of imaginarized supplement. So like this is where arguments of like the epistemological category for psychoanalysis, ordinary psychosis might come in. Um, and then lastly, I think, yeah, it would be more of like this Marxist analysis of how some of his conclusions kind of Louis Theroux's conclusions kind of reify, in my opinion, sort of bourgeois hegemony and the libidinal economy that precipitates from the social relations and even social fragmentation in capitalism. Um, but yeah, like I mean, you watched it the other day. I just watched it today, so it's somewhat fresh on my mind. But maybe we could go into like the logic of sexuation and the phallus, both in Seminar Four and then in 20. Like maybe give us the breakdown of like what this documentary is about before we like go
Right.
into this.
So Louis Theroux is a journalist and a documentarian. At least I think he's a journalist. I mean, his approach is journalistic in that he asks questions, he feigns to be objective, and he tries to be, you know, to the extent that he can, uninvolved in these sorts of ideological statements that are proffered throughout his documentaries. His whole technique is sort of to simply ask questions and let the people that he's talking to expose themselves in a way. I think what happens in this documentary, though, is that because I've seen his other documentaries, and in this one, it seems to me that he wasn't as prepared to be dealing with people who all day, every day are spouting this nonsense to a wide audience and are used to dealing with, detractors, or who, in some sense, have developed all of these rhetorical devices to at least sound credible to, really ingenuous young people, or just, very, very dumb people. Very dumb,
Extremely dumb. Exactly. Like
very
for
dumb,
example,
extremely hopeless people. And I don't want to even paint everybody with that brush.
gullible
I
maybe.
idolize these guys. I mean, there's a definite separation between the people who are just sort of just hopelessly idiotic that are into them, and then people who I think could be steered in another direction, and then kids, teens who don't really know better. But the point I'm trying to make about that is just a little context for Louis, and then the three influencers that are featured here. The one guy's named HSTikkyTokky, who I hadn't heard of, who has some following. He's probably the most typical of the Manosphere guys. The other guy is Justin Waller, I think his name is, and he's associated with the Tate brothers, who we all know very well. And then there is Myron from Fresh and Fit, who
It's funny. A lot of his stuff had popped up in my algorithm. It's like I like one like slightly like racist meme, and then all of a sudden like all these things come up. It's like the sort of crazy manosphere algorithm, just like parasitic. It's like you can't like one thing without this,
yeah,
popping on
you
your algorithm.
open Pandora's box. This is an aside, but I'm convinced that of all these Manosphere guys, that Myron dude is somehow the most evil. I don't know what it is about him. I mean, they're all sickening in their own way, but he's like truly sickening. And I don't know what it is about him. I'll bet you that Andrew and Tristan Tate have committed more evil deeds than Myron from Fresh and Fit, but there's something about Myron that just strikes me as like, I don't know what it is about him. It seems like particularly evil. I was like, I really hate this guy more than any of the other ones.
Well, there's almost like a very strong disavowal that's perverse in all of them. Not to say that they're structurally perverts, but there's something that like the inconsistencies and the knowledge that they have mirror a sort of perverse trait.
Yeah.
Um, Especially with like how they appeal to like traditional marriage, but it's like my wife practices one side monogamy, meaning they're monogamous and loyal to me because that's how they are by nature. Like women are supposed to be like that by nature, these like
Right.
like points, but I'm not. And at the same time, I don't promote that. Like I don't promote anybody who follows me to,
Yes.
you know,
So let's get back on track. Thank you
yeah.
for getting me back on track here. Basically, the thing that struck me the most is okay, so this one guy, you know, um, he's in Spain, I believe.
The HS TikTok.
HSTikkyTokky guy,
Yeah.
because he can't go
I think
back
he's
to
from the
England
UK. Yeah.
because
Of a hit and run.
there's an active court case going on against him because of this hit and run. Um, but he, along with Justin Waller and Myron, uh, is something of a pimp, really. Like, I mean, he is selling OnlyFans content in his Telegram, and he like rents homes and has all of these girls in the house recording, porn together. And it's like he espouses this view where it's like he believes in the traditional nuclear family. He believes only a fairly chaste woman is worth marrying, and that he wants a woman that's just like mama, as chaste as he imagines his mother is, a real woman who has traditional values and adheres by them. And later in the documentary, at the end, she makes an appearance as his mother, which is one of the most interesting parts of the documentary when you hear what she has to say about his work. But yeah, the point is that there is a very, obviously and very fairly uninteresting on the surface of it paradox here, or contradiction, between his attitudes towards the majority of womankind as a whole and what he perceives to be their um sluttier inclinations, which degrade them. The fact that he's selling this content made by women who disgust him, and then the virginal ideal he has of the woman who would be worthy of marriage and motherhood. Now, this is nothing new, right? This isn't even something that's unique to like the manosphere, although I don't think it's ever been articulated in these terms exactly, like the terms that they set up. But it's like, the distance that he takes from the work that he does reveals so much about, well, on the one hand, ideology in what people call late stage capitalism, and then the logic of the phallus, I would say. And it really aligns with some thoughts that I've had recently about perversion. And I'm kind of on the fence right now, and I'd like to write something about this, on whether or not, we should talk about a generalized foreclosure or a generalized perversion, or whether it even matters whether, we're in one camp or the other. But yeah, what you mentioned there about this perverse trait rings true to me, because it's like everything we're reading in Seminar 4 is reflected in this attitude. I think that so many of these guys are still trapped at the stage of wanting to be the phallus for the mother, in a sense. And what does it mean to want to be the phallus for the mother? It would be to complete her, to be reabsorbed in the mother or the other in such a way that the other is not lacking. In Lacanian terms, for Lacan, what ultimately would enable at least a neurotic subject, typically neurotic subject, to achieve separation from the mother is the intervention of the name of the father. Now, Louis points out that so many of these men are, in fact, fatherless. And that's no minor detail. The absence of the father can, but doesn't always, result in a very pronounced absence of the name of the father. And what that means there is no sort of, symbolic, we were talking about this in our recent cartel meeting, severance of, let's say, the umbilical cord. So there is an attachment to the mother. And you see this, of course, in the first guy we were talking about, HSTikkyTokky. And HS is, very attached to his mother. But that isn't all that radical of a thought right now, the way I'm putting it. It's kind of like what's interesting about it is the way this results in a very Gnostic dichotomy between woman as one of a series of, sluts in his mind, and then, like I was saying, woman as virginal.
Yeah, it's the sluts and also like those that are trying to impose rules and norms on society and take away masculine, which is not even just inherent to HSTikkyTokky, but to all of the manospheres, that we have this like Manichaeist duality of like men on one side and the feminists trying to take, the mark of virility, to use a Schreberian term. Check out our last episode on Seminar 3 for that. And then this sort of Gnostic conspiracy of escaping the matrix, which is supposed to be exemplary of why they label themselves as red pilled, like taking the red pill to escape the matrix, which is so funny because like, how do they do that? By not by refusing these mandates and norms
Right.
from society, right? Which is also funny because in the sort of pre to Oedipal relation, when the child starts to express its desire in Freud and Lacanian terms, is the refusal of the other's demand. It's when the child smacks the spoon from the hand that's feeding him. That's the first expression of a desire, which is quite hysteric in its trajectory, but doesn't always lead in hysteria. Because from the unconscious choice, I'll get back to on track to what we're saying, but from that unconscious choice of hysteria to neurosis, we have the experience of enjoyment of an erotic nature in Freud's infantile sexuality that's so pleasurable that it's too much. So there must be a neurotic prohibition on there. Versus the one who will take the hysterical position experiences something that's so disgusting or so unpleasant that creates a sort of gap in the field of the other and how they relate to the world and even this question of femininity, right? But to get back on track, to this HSTikkyTokky guy, it's as if like, on the one hand we have like this disgust for these women, right, that are sluts that make content by selling their whatever, having sex with every dude on the planet. And then you have this ideal of the virgin mother, right? Or of just like the woman, which is very exemplary of like what Lacan would call like the investment into courtly love, where like woman as such as ideal is almost like close to like this mysterious other, the mysterious Das Ding, but also like with God. So like courtly love in the face of woman with a capital W is like the second face of the big other, which is also another face for God. And it seems like the way that he interacts with these women on OnlyFans, that he, in a sense, pimps out and sells their content on Telegram, is like, in a sense, also an expression of how he handles his waste. His enjoyment is also his waste, right?
Mm.
And this seems to relate to the relation he has with his mother in this sort of how did you describe it, as like this umbilical cord relationship? Like there's no symbolic severance as such, and so like it's almost as if this particular person has perverse traits because they could do so many perverse things without prohibition, and also extreme distance. And even the way that like I found interesting is that like how he like said like, feminists are ruining everything. I can't stand the feminists, but somehow like, like when Thoreau was like, well, what is you have a mother, what does your mom think of this? Well, she doesn't really get on board with a lot of what I say. She can't stand racism, homophobia,
Right.
etc. But she wouldn't approve of what I say. But nevertheless, he doesn't express that same hatred to her like he does with other women, because I guess in her past she had this kind of like feminist or like independent quality to her. Um, I
Yeah,
forget what I
it's
was going to go with that, but I
no,
think
it's all it. No, go ahead. Yeah,
I think of the last, what I was trying to like get at is just like this sort of psychic and libidinal dynamic of this particular figure, because he's definitely still tied to the mother, and this is where we could even see how, like, in a sense, we're balancing through a narcissistic relationship and one that would be what would be called anaclitic, where he's learning
yeah,
how to love from the backboard of being loved, right? The anaclitic relationship is when the caretaker or the mother is expressing to the child love, and so the person is that's the baby is in a position of being loved. So when he loves others, he loves how he was loved, right? Um, and it's never a perfect transition; it could always backfire, right? This is the whole point of the Oedipal complex. But it seems like he's not in this like perfectly anaclitic, but I wouldn't even say he's in a perfect narcissistic way, right? He's not trying to find um himself in other women. It's almost like there's something. It's almost like it's almost like there's something to the way that he treats uh women that are countable in a way that's almost like enjoyment and trash, but at the same time trying to find the woman that fits the ideal, right? And I don't know if he would still be neurotic in that sense, like the Don Juan who counts one by one, but still hopes to find the one. Because in a sense, it's not sure, and we would fall into wild analysis if we start to get too lost in the sauce with this. And by that, I just mean like trying to provoke a diagnosis without putting this man on the couch, right? But
right.
by the way that he expresses himself, it seems like there's something of a typical like neurotic structure, but also one with strong perverse traits in the way that he's able to distance himself. And even if it's questioned by Thoreau, it doesn't seem to have an effect, right? And actually, what's interesting about all three of these dudes is that they somehow position Thoreau as this imaginary other, right? I find that interesting, right? He's not a symbolic other, he's just an
Right.
imaginary other. Right? So it
Yeah,
becomes sort of rivalry,
right. Because
suspicion.
they are a priori fearful and paranoid ab- about his role as well, almost it's almost as if he's in the position of the analyst here for them, just via his presence um and reputation, of course, but you know his presence brings out all sorts of symptomal responses that kind of like shoot in various directions. But well, what if we go into Oedipus really quickly? I would like to sort of, within the limited extent of my powers, try to like break down what Oedipus is, what the Oedipus complex is, and why this severance doesn't occur. And it can lead to our second point, related to the, well, absence of the symbolic ritual that allows for initiation into a community, a society. Um, the whole idea of Oedipus is that the infant, and of course, I'm going to narrate this from the point of view of the boy child, because for the girl child, it's a different story entirely. And I feel like we should put this proviso out there that when we talk about boy and girl, it's not like we're trying to exclude anyone who would identify as non-binary. These are two subjective positions of sexuation that have to do with knowledge and truth and what it means to um, complete the other or to
Yeah.
attempt to complete the other, right?
And
Wouldn't you say?
yes, and also just another proviso because this is the Lacanian lens that Nick is saying, but also from the Freudian lens. When Freud is introducing Oedipus complex, he has constantly revising his theory of sexuality and infantile sexuality, and that babies and children and adolescents already have some form of sexuality imbued in them, but it's not like they are born with innate sexuality. It's that it's given to them by the structures of the family. So it's already symptomal. And to put this in a sort of microscopic lens, it's structured around this theory of the drive, which the drive is distinct from instincts. And so, as you were saying, like it's not as if like the boy and the girl are like literal boy and girl, but rather that the structure of the drive has this bisexuality nature of being either a passive way of loving or an active way of loving, which
Hmm.
ultimately inverts for Freud inverts on one another. And Lacan will have many ways to kind of expand on that from just this duality of just passive and active. But like for the drive and for sexuation, it's about how one loves the other and not a literal act of fucking. But it can
Well,
become metonymic to that for the
well, actually, that's interesting you said that because that's the exact word that just popped into my head to take up this dynamic you're talking about between passive and active. I mean, Oedipus one on, I was going to say 101, 101 here it is a one-on-one relationship between the infant who, for the very sake of being an object within the world that can, in some sense, apprehend himself as such, must ultimately separate from the mother. He must achieve a kind of separation that would allow for the existence of, well, object love, other objects in the world that he can direct his libidinal cathexes towards that are not just his mother. And also, you know, capture himself as just that, as an individuated self. This separation is a gradual process wherein the perverse, impossible vacillation that the infant experiences as they grow to the age of like about 5 or 6 struggles with between these poles of being a part of the mother, I would say, like, and then something for a world outside of the mother is hellish in a sense because, well, what is a metonymic object? It's an object that's always changing, undergoing these permutations, these transformations. What does the mother want in me becomes the central question. And how can I model myself um, against the like sort of facsimiles of different objects that I think would be pleasing to the mother? There is something truly traumatic, and you touch on this in the interview you did with Avgi is how you pronounce her name, right?
Avgi.
Avgi. My apologies. Yeah, Avgi.
Shout out to Avgi.
Shout out to Avgi because I love that interview and I love what she had to say about Laplanche's resurrection of the seduction theory here. But the idea is that there is something truly destabilizing and you know, anxiety provoking in experiencing the unconscious sexual desire of the mother, which she, of course, because it's unconscious, can't help but in some sense manifest in her interactions with the child. And that creates anxiety. It creates a kind of like confusion, and the child in one way wishes to return to this intrauterine world of bliss, which would in its ultimate form be the womb, you know, and that is, I think, has something to do with Freud's oceanic feeling that he just describes in Civilization and its discontents. You know, this is an oceanic world that the child once inhabited and has some sort of physical memory of. Um, and then the, like you were saying, the disgusting, erotic pleasure that the child gets from its connection with the mother, breastfeeding, but also all of the partial drives, which take on a certain symbolic significance for the child. So, you know, suckling at the breast becomes also a symbol of being devoured, of devoration, right? The act of being devoured, you know, the mouth and the teeth and the
Yeah,
suck itself. It becomes like that, becomes enlarged to the point where I will be ultimately devoured.
yeah, and this is what's so interesting because it's like I wonder to what extent that in the this like seduction moment, and there are many primal fantasies that Freud and Lacan talk about, but like the resurrection of seduction theory in Laplanche, and even how I think Gerard Cormier, a student of Lacan as well, talks about it. Like when I think of the seduction of the unconscious of the parent, and let's say the mother in this instance, to the child, it could be very anxiety provoking, and I wonder if there is this continual presence of the sexual unconscious of the mother that in handling that anxiety would create a perversion for the child versus if the child has a sort of separation from that via a paternal function, we get more of a neurotic, right? That's able to repress, that's able to create the mechanisms of repression, right?
Right, right.
Uh, because there's something
Exactly. Yeah.
about the presence of the other, not even as mother, but as caretaker, where a child is acquiring language, but they don't have any symbolic differentiation of a presence and absence. So, like the maybe Freud's grandson that he talks about in Beyond the Pleasure Pencil might have had some sort of maybe scene of seduction, but it didn't have the quality of making him perverse because there's this moment of separation of the mother when she hands him to Freud to watch over, and then he starts playing these games, mastering the scene of separation versus trying to acquire a scene of seduction. Because something about the seduction, and it doesn't even have to be from the mother. The seduction can be from the father. But when there's a seduction of the other, the problem is that there could be a death wish to that where you get devoured, but also that it becomes feminizing in the sense that and here they use these terms, but these aren't to be taken as gendered terms if you're new to psychoanalysis. It means that you constantly become an object of the drive, right? To where you are trying to be loved in the you could say the gaze of the other. You're trying to be seen. And so this is where things like a perversion could take a hold, where to master this scene, you put yourself in scenes of voyeurism, exhibitionism. You are in the field of the scopic, I would want to say. I could be wrong, but that's how I kind of interpret
Well,
it.
that makes sense because what would be a more violent and extreme example of being in the field of the scopic than being a social media influencer broadcasting your life
Mhm.
24/7 to
Exactly.
strangers
Yeah.
to unknown others who constitute
Mm-hmm.
all of the, anonymous, invisible parts of the other, capital O, big other, and to, in some sense, like they incarnate that digitally for someone like HS. But the point is here that to be the exactor of all of these dictates of prohibition, you would need an outside agent, something that's often ignored here when we talk about all the common tropes of Lacanian metapsychology is the agent in the process of like going from being the phallus for the mother to possessing the phallus, or wishing to possess the phallus as an object that would be attained in the field of the other, and opening up that space. So, of course, anyone who knows anything about the Oedipus myth is that, the whole Oedipal dynamic, the triangle here, really it's quadrilateral for Lacan with the phallus, but the triangle of Oedipus backfires on the character of Oedipus because he ends up committing the two acts, which are the most horrific because in addition to the incest prohibition, he also kills his father. Two of the most evil things a person can do. I mean, to this day. So it's like a through line from antiquity to now. And of course, he's doomed to wandering the world as a blind vagrant, essentially. But the agency of the father intervenes to say, not only to the child, no, you can't be the end all be all for your mother, meaning you cannot be reintegrated into your mother and occupy her womb. Be the it's interesting because like also be the phallus for her and turn her into this perverse, almost like in a strange way transsexual being that the child almost wishes her to be, in the sense of completing her. That's
Yeah,
just
both a father and a mother all
both
in
the father and the mother at the same time, because like who needs it, the infant understands at a very visceral level that you don't really need a father, and that the perfect Edenic situation would be without fathers in a
Yeah, and
strange way.
this is where like even the question like I know like Ellie has read more of this than I have, but with little Hans, even though he's classified as like the phobic, that like when he starts to discover that he has a penis and he calls it a whittler, that everybody has a whittler, right? And that like in his whole fantasy, he constructs in his imagination like what a father would be like. And wanting to like create children or something like that, but his like relationship to the mother is almost in a sort of perverse way where he even formulates a disavowal regarding who has a penis and who doesn't. Literally the I know very well but formula
Right.
is stated in little Hans. And even in this moment of like uh wanting to be the thing that plugs the mothers up, right? Because we talked about the phallus, but what is that? Well, in seminar 4 we get this symbol of the phallus, which is very much something that we see in Freud, but Freud kind of in some senses literalizes the symbol of the phallus, which comes from like a totemic uh like mythology to like the literal penis. And in some senses from his like work with analysans and talking about their childhood sexuality and the ways that they related to their body, the phallus did have some status of like the literal organ. But for Lacan, it's something that situates one, as we'll see, in relationship to sexuality and even like the Oedipus complex or castration complex. But in seminar 4, this phallus is also the pre-Oedipal phallus, where, as you pointed out, the mother substitutes her own lack of satisfaction for the child. So the image of the child that she has is that sort of phallus,
Right.
right, of enjoyment, and there's
Right.
also that obscene quality that could come if there isn't that separation, which would produce a sort of what we would call the maternal superego, which is obscene. I'm gonna eat you up, like you're so
Yeah.
cute and so handsome, like I just want to have you all to myself, right? And it becomes like this sort of umbilical symbiotic relationship where the child feels like it's everything for the mother, right, and wants to like be that thing, versus the superego that we get in the Oedipus, which is saying to renounce, right? And to say like thou shalt not, um
Yeah. And
produce guilt.
what's so interesting is that, if the mother isn't psychotic, then the lack that the mother has is an unconscious, castrated, neurotic lack that is based on her repression. And that lack is something that the infant becomes very crucially aware of, but not yet having undergone castration responds to that lack with their body. Like, wouldn't you say, like, giving their body over to the mother, but then also, regretting that choice and needing to create distance and pull back. And there's this vacillation that goes on. The rage that the child feels at the realization that the mother is not arriving to meet my demands in time is directed towards the outside agent or agency of this father who becomes an imaginary rival. It's to kill the father, defeat the father. And this is what so many Greek myths happen to be about, which is like killing, defeating the father. And ultimately, the father, who is always more powerful, who is always going to be experienced as a tyrant and an interloper in this one-to-one relationship, is also going to retroactively be, I think, experienced as a kind of savior who gives the child the breathing room that they need to be free from this impossible, anxiety provoking vacillation between, being and having. So, whereas, I think it was Jacques Alain Miller says, if the name of the father could speak, it would say, you cannot be the phallus. So that is deeply upsetting and traumatic for the child, but also relieving. All of these different stages of trauma are also, in a sense, and if they are culturally and socially ratified, all the more so traumatic, but also relieving. So the idea is that with castration, what's castrated is not the child who has attached any real importance to their whittler so much as the realization that what they do in fact have, what they do, have dangling between their legs is so insufficient compared to what the father wields, in a sense. And what came to mind, and I'm sure I've read this somewhere, I think it might have been in Plague of Fantasies by Zizek. I'm not sure he's talking about phallic logic here, but it's kind of like if you think about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they've been naked the entire time, right? But what really dawns on them, horrifically so, is not that it's not that their clothes are taken from them. They didn't have them in the first place. It's that they realize their nakedness after they eat the apple and gain knowledge. So the father, in some sense, imparts a kind of knowledge onto the child, I would say, and it's a knowledge that induces a shame, right? Wouldn't you say a shame? Or I don't want to conflate the two, and you can definitely like deconflate everything I'm talking about here. But I feel like there's a kind of a shame and a guilt that ensues here. A shame of nakedness, or the sense of like impotence that the child experiences upon castration, and then guilt for having wanted to, in some perverse sense, have returned to the mother, to want to analytically be a part of her, to complete her.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I think like the guilt is necessarily like inherited it from like the inherence of the name of the father. Um, but I'm not so sure about shame. I think that sounds about right. But I just know that for a fact that the guilt is the sort of debt that you get, right, from um going into this Oedipus complex, which kind of fits into the. I mean, we won't go into this because there's still a lot to touch on the first point, but just to kind of like preview like what Freud, even though Freud, I think, was scientifically trying to create like a sort of anthropology in this work Totem and Taboo, using the current anthropology of his time, I think devises a psychoanalytic myth. It's a sort of like philosophical anthropology, not a sort of scientific anthropology that takes place in any like point in history. It's a sort of like transcendental frame, if anything, and it's the myth of the primal horde. And this fits perfectly in like the Oedipus, and even when we're going to break down sexuation, because you have this myth of primitive society. There is the father of the primal horde who enjoys all the women, who's ravaged and violent and threatens to castrate all the men in the tribe that try to trespass upon his enjoyment. And the sons all band together to murder him. And after they murder him, they eat him. And then they realize that they're all brothers, which is kind of funny because like they eat them and they realize they're all brothers. It's kind of like when you eat the apple, you realize you're naked. And so then the brotherhood is founded on a social bond of okay, we will not do, it's founded on a crime of patricide, and we will not do what the father did. And to prevent that, nobody is allowed to join all women to themselves. You are allotted one woman to yourself.
Mm.
And so you have a society that's forged upon that. And with that, they inherit the guilt of the crime, the guilt of the father. So the father lives on in a totemic way, right? And Freud says, what is a father but a dead father? And this shouldn't be, to anybody who's hearing this for the first time, be too like out of pocket, because this is what we see in religion all the time. Even Freud talked about in his work Moses and Monotheism that a society or a religion is always founded by an outsider, and then that outsider is murdered. Moses was an Egyptian and then murdered by his own people after finding, society of Judaism. And then we could see this, what else, in Christianity with, the father sending his only son to only become crucified. And then the society of Christianity is established. So there's always a murdering of someone that then establishes a law and order, right? And an inheritance of
Mm.
the guilt of the dead father precipitates into everybody, right? And that inheritance of the guilt is going to be what formulates the super ego. And so, like, I guess why I bring that up is because, I mean, we'll get that more in depth into the second point regarding like why these influencers attract so many followers and these groups. But I think this shows like the logic of sexuation and how Lacan would formulate it, because you have his formalization of all these scattered blueprints of Freud's theory of sexuality. And he's able to formalize it in seminar 19 and 20. And so we all fall under to this. And so, like, you have the masculine logic, and then you have the logic of the feminine, and you have four different quadrants. So on the left quadrant, you have two quadrants that represent the masculine side, and on the right quadrant, you have what represents the feminine side. And again, has nothing to do with gender, because any gender can fall under this, because this has to do with how you relate to the phallus and how you love or be loved. And so the masculine logic is that all men are submitted to the phallic function and are castrated, right? Or it's written as like all men exist under the phallic function and can be written by this and castrated by this. But that can only exist insofar as there's always an excluded one, right? The one who isn't castrated. There exists one who is not submitted to the phallic function, right? So this is where we get this law of exclusion, that there's always one man who is not submitted to this, who can enjoy all women. Yeah. But the fact is, like God, the only thing he's lacking is an existing body, right? So this excluded other is always this man as an ideal, or this one, an attempt to be one. And then on the other side, we have, there does not exist a woman who is not submitted to the phallic function. And then we have not all women, right, are submitted to the phallic function. And this is where Lacan becomes more sort of, you could say, radical, because not all women fall into the phallic function, right? The one who falls into the phallic function, if I understand it correctly, is the one that tries to be the all, or tries to be the one for man, right? This is where we get this like fantasy of the sexual relationship versus the not all, those that can't be included into this phallic, for lack of a better term, if you just want to use patriarchal logic, that not everybody is submitted to the patriarchal logic, right? Which is built off of an exclusion, right? A sort of humorous exclusion, because the one who's enjoying all is dead.
Right. Well, all right, let's try to gradually bring it down from these dizzying heights that you've brought us to very eloquently. And that was an amazing breakdown, because I'm not there yet. I could never break it down in the way that you just did there with the quadrants, but I think I have an idea of what you're talking about. And I think all right, let's take it back to HS. And I think, it goes without saying, this is as much attention and depth of analysis that's been brought to bear on this guy and his activity online. But here we have, to take it back to Oedipus, and a subject who, yes, may be perverse, is castrated, and would aspire to occupy the place of the dead father, in a sense. And I think this is, and you can steer me back on path if I'm wrong, but it seems almost like the anthropological myth that Freud gives us in Totem and Taboo, with the myth of the primal horde, is, of course, meant to, in scare quotes, be universal, right? A constant or an invariant within, at least, let's say, the West. Let's just give critics their due and say, like, okay, let's make this kind of something that's playing out within the parameters of Western society, and say that it's universal enough within Western society. the thing about capitalism today is that because unlike any other society throughout history, any other communal formation, there are no clear cut being the operative word here, rites of passage. So if attaining manhood in other societies, whether they are tribal societies, um, or even as early as like medieval societies, depends on a series of cuts, a series of separations, a series of actual literal separations from the mother, and then symbolic separations of, like, for instance, I don't know, being kidnapped in the middle of the night and being made to hunt a tiger or something like that. Then we lack that in society today. Not that there aren't cultures in America, people that immigrate here and maintain their traditions, but those traditions are still always at variance with the monoculture that we're all kind of, the current of which we're always swimming against in one way or another. What I see here in this documentary are men that, without realizing it, are bemoaning the absence of a ritual of separation from the mother. And, upon interrogation, they are made to like confront certain paradoxes in their worldview that something to do with the perverse position that they've been sort of like forced into due to this lack of any sort of real symbolic separation that would secure a kind of recognition by the other, the big other, that would initiate them into a society of like the primal horde, the brotherhood, who that the brotherhood of the we got like parasites, like that are united by this parasite, this murdering of the father. I mean, there's so much going on there because they have this inherited guilt. They're united by this guilt. They understand that their crime is horrific. It defines their brotherhood, but it cannot happen again, right? And it can't happen again because one woman should be allotted to each man. I'm not saying this in like a Jordan Peterson kind of way of like, oh, well, if we just, made it, mandatory by the state for like one woman for each man, then we wouldn't be in these kind of issues. The whole idea is that they're united by this crime. It confers an identity on them, an identity as one who is castrated, and no one can ultimately possess all of the women and enjoy in this way that is, ultimately disgusting, a disgust that led to the murder of this father. But if we're going to go back to the four discourses, if in the capitalist discourse, which isn't, as you've pointed out before, a real discourse, if it begins with object A as the waste product, if that's the prime mover, right? Am I correct there? Like it begins with object A, right? As the
No, it's actually it's actually, if you look at the discourse of the master, it's flipped. So actually, like, it's the split subject aiming at like the S1, a master's discourse. Is it all right if I share my screen to actually try to draw it out Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so like I have it right here. So this would be, let's put the master's discourse right here first. This is just exemplary of the social bond, right? This is what it means to enter into society. If you could see this on my screen, and this will make sense right here in a bit. But Lacan devises from his reading of Freud's group psychology, as well as his reading of Totem and Taboo, that ultimately we have a discourse which is structured by language, and structures all bonds pretty much for the most part. So this is like the excluded logic that starts it all. You have the split subject that addresses a signifier and is represented by the signifier as such that addresses this field of knowledge, right? And this produces the waste product called the object ah. What does that mean? It means, and again, we have to also bring in the fact that he's drawing from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, which in a sense he sees parallel with Freud, because if the scene of the perfect crime found society, so does also this battle for prestige, right? To be the one who is the master and those that recognize him as such, right? This is what this. So we have sort of a condensation of two anthropological myths. One of prohibiting something from being done, and also one of recognition, right? And so we have also what the unconscious is doing. This is also a discourse of the unconscious that comes into an analysis, that we have a split subject, a suffering subject, a neurotic subject who can only be addressed and represented by a signifier that is supposed to be a part of his symptom, to a field, which is the unconscious, of certain signifiers that try to represent this subject and ultimately produce what? It produces jouissance, this thing that is also the waste product, which is also sort of geared toward his suffering. And the inverse, because we live in capitalist society. Let's see, where is my eraser? Can I do the eraser? I could probably draw it right here. We have the capitalist discourse, which actually flips the left side of the master's discourse into this. And so we have the arrow going down. We have this. And we don't have a social bond. So this arrow on top means that we have a social bond. So we all, in an ideal society, we all operate like this, in this form of recognition and unconscious repression and slippages. But because of capitalism derailing social bonds, we don't have that anymore. What we have is a interior 8,
Right.
right, of an endless loop of one's own solitude, right? So it kind of goes into this racetrack thing of like, this coming right here and this going like right here. So they're in this like Mobius strip of enjoyment and suffering all alone, right? And so because capitalism creates this, there's no social bond. It seems like what the influencers have the opportunity to is to create some sort of, you could say, prosthetic social bond.
I like that. But wouldn't you say it's like you are in the capitalist discourse as a split subject
Yeah.
directly assailed by
Mm-hmm.
the waste product
Of commodity enjoyment,
of
right?
commodity enjoyment before you could even um, conceive of S2
Yeah. Yeah.
saying.
So even like thinking this out, like the master's discourse outside of like the psychoanalytic context, because when you enter into analysis, you try to enter yourself as a master, that you know what you're talking about. You're addressing a field of knowledge, but then you realize that knowledge is actually an alienation of your own unconscious knowledge. That knowledge that you actually talked about when you mentioned the name of the Father, that it kind of constructs this knowledge of something that must be repressed. Um, Versus the way that capitalism orients our own way that we interact with one another. We're not interacting with one another. We're interacting with our own commodified enjoyment, and it's all siloed, right? So we don't have a field to recognize the other. We just have a field where we're trying to plug the demand that capitalism brings to us. So like it by plugging the demand, we're trying to plug all these spontaneous and this is very crude in general, but just for lack of a better term, like, you know, all these advertisements that are coming up to us like, hey, like buy one get one free, these are all the like, look what Amazon can give you in like, 24 hours versus
Right.
if you order from some other thing. And then like we have the field of commodities and all the surplus value and surplus enjoyment that continues to enter in this split subject that doesn't satisfy them. It just makes
Best
them,
best exemplified by the if you've ever been on Temu, the amount of pop-ups and like roulette wheels that you know assault you before you could even possibly get to the checkout. It's like the ultimate expression, I think, of this um just the howling uh you know many-faced abyss of the waste product
mm-hmm.
just
Yeah, and I think to tie this,
attacking you.
yeah, and to tie this because that was a lot. To tie this into like what we're talking about with this documentary, I feel like this is what these manosphere influencers and podcasters are doing. Like, hey, you like, and it's this like lonely, disgruntled teen boy or someone who's lost and siloed in their own enjoyment, grappling with not only like their suffering and enjoyment, but also like their maneuvering in society and their existential questions. Like, hey, you, this is why you're, not buff, or this is why you're not like, fucking all the bitches and this and that and the third. And let me tell you why. And so like they're just like allowing them to enter into this capitalist discourse via this is how you be a man. You need to get your own money, right? You need to get all the girls, and then you need to also take the red pill and escape the matrix, right? Which never really escapes the matrix. It actually just is actually the promotion of the capitalist discourse. Because what do you have to do? You have to make money. What do you have to do?
Right.
You have to get all the commodity products, which are just like, scourged onto this idea of women, right? But at the same time, also like still achieve that courtly love of woman.
Right. Yeah. 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 That's what I'm trying to get at is basically if here, Jouissance as a waste product is the prime mover of the discourse, then in trying to occupy the position of object A here, you're forced to commodify yourself to ultimately be that which, in a sexuated sense, would be the perfect ideal man in this fantasy of oneness for the other, while also possessing the seriality of countable women simultaneously. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's almost like in a sense, if you are able to occupy that position of objet as like not just waste product, but as the commodity product, which is of course still waste, right? It's countable waste. That you are also like this other that's enjoying, and you're one because like you have the commodity as such, like the perfect commodity. You are that perfect commodity, and you have knowledge of that, and you are, I guess, like the ideal partner. And I guess maybe you could even see how like not only the influencer bros that we've been talking about in this documentary try to portray themselves to men, but even how like dating apps try to make you portray yourself for the ideal other you want to date. You're the ideal partner for an ideal other that seem to like fit like hand in glove, right?
Well, that leads us to the second guy,
Mm-hmm.
um, who's older.
And that's the one that it has a relationship with the Tate brothers, right?
Right. The Tate guy, Justin Waller. HS is like 23. That Justin Waller guy seems like he's, I don't know, pushing 50 or something. And he has a wife, and it's a one-sided open relationship that he has. And Louis talks to the wife at some point who has an entire uh you see the entire spectrum of rationalizations that she deploys to like justify her position in this scheme, and it nothing could be a more could stand as like a more circuitous attempt to rationalize the lack of sexual relationship here than what this guy's setup exemplifies in some way. With his wife open on one side, she cannot have any partner but him. He can have ultimate part, like endless partners, endless series of continuing to count women one by one, all but also possessing the one that would confer upon him a kind of unity that would be transcendent of that waste in some ways. And that is what I see as the ultimate perverse, but it could also be, one could argue, a symptom of a kind of generalized psychosis of occupying the place of the one, of being one, and without sacrificing the accountability of woman.
What I found interesting about this second one too was that like this is what I said, like the way that they position Louis Theroux is that like when he tries to like expose, like not Louis but the dude, what's his name, Jared Walsh, is that his name? I forget his name. um
um Justin
Justin
Waller.
Justin Waller, like he like the way he like sets up that fact that he's in a one-sided monogamous relationship where his wife is loyal to him and only him, and that he gets to sleep with other women. He's like, now I'm about to say this, but like people get upset. Like he has to give like this sort of like forewarning. And
Yeah.
then the way that he positions Louis as if he's this person that's somehow upset by that, like it's almost very like paranoiac. And also like he situates this Louis from like a position of the big other as this like one who's like in this field of knowledge of journalism and documentary to like this imaginary other that's supposed to be upset by this like brutal and honest fact that this is just who
Right.
I am and this is how our relationship is and this is just how men and women are supposed to be, right? uh,
Right.
and I guess like to add to this too, because this is where like it gets really Lacanian, is that like with all of them, but it seems like with him in particular, he's in this fantasy of how men are, or men ought to be, and how women just are, right?
Yeah.
And how there is this sort of war of the sexes.
Yeah.
And
And
this
if I can,
war of the sexes is perfectly situated in what I was talking about, trying to map out the field of sexuation, because it's through the law of the father and this excluded other that not only do you learn how to love, but you also know how to conduct war. And you're actually conducting war on the father. When you hate women, you don't hate women as such. You love women as such. What you're hating
that's
is the
what they
object.
all say. They're
Yeah,
all, I
yeah,
love women.
yeah. What you're actually,
Maybe a little too much, that.
yeah, yeah. Because the fact is that it's not that these women are enjoying on their own, it's the fact that they're enjoying other men, right? And it's the fact that you have to put war on the father. This is what Gerard Pommier in this work, everybody, what does it mean to make love? He says is that like to hate the object of love or women is to conduct war on the father, right?
Mm.
So in the sense, they're in a sense in an Oedipal dynamic. Uh,
Yeah. And I think tying something that Justin Waller says into what you're laying out here, something he points out, and this could actually lead to the next topic of discussion I wanted to hit, is that he says, you know, women are born with inherent value insofar as, and he's talking about, a woman who would be attractive to men like him based on mainstream standards of beauty. A woman is born with an inherent value such that she would be invited onto a man's yacht just based on the way that she looks. And a man, on the other hand, has to prove his worth and increase his value by making all of the moves which would earn him the trappings of success and wealth and the perfect physique and all of the right indicators and descriptors of alphaness, of being the one, the father. That's something that involves labor, right? So what he's saying is that women don't need to labor to achieve value, and that's okay. That's the way it should be. Men do, but he's saying that the ideology that your average man is exposed to, and here, of course, what he has in mind is some sort of paranoiac specter of wokeness, which is, of course,
Gender ideology.
gender ideology, which is, you know, aimed at dissolving, these archetypal, naturalistic features that are inbuilt in society in his mind, but that basically the man must labor to achieve value, and woman is valuable in and of herself by default and merely exists to be, inserted as a peg into the basic framework of society, and that things have been flipped on their head because of, I guess, the Jews. It all goes back to the Jews.
Right. And all these interviewed influencers all follow some weird like satanic cabal, and Sam Smith somehow in a satanic cult because of the concert that he did. And then like, yeah, like it's the Jews all the way down that are creating the satanic gender woke transgender ideology. And that
Yeah.
they want to take away and deprivilege masculinity, which today's youth should be proud of, and not have it trespassed or kidnapped from them.
Right. So, all right, to take it into more Marxist territory, what I was thinking is that you have countless men out there, young men who are effectively fatherless, even if they have a father. Their fathers aren't effective role models. They don't feel like they have too many people to look up to. And again, the word model here is important because it's like they don't have anyone upon whom they could like model their behavior, their choices, or just in a Lacanian sense, symbolically, the absence of the father as a continuing presence, you know, means that there is no prohibitory function here. And without prohibition, anything goes, including in their minds a loose gender ideology, which leads to non-binary binarism of some kind, which is very interesting. If you think of like non-binary is really the enemy for them, because it's like things need to be 0 or 1. There cannot be a blurred line between absence and presence. There must be a clear demarcating line here. And it's just interesting how their solution is, as you were saying, to become the person that capitalism, in its enforcement of, in its almost like in the way it decrees certain exigencies based on this waste product being omnipotent answers all of those demands perfectly to the T, uh, in such a way that they're able to ultimately transcend and be godlike and be the ultimate model for all of these lost men. Now, here it's like we have an absence of the social bond, but this bond is dissolved not by liberals with their woke ideology, but the very functioning and mode of production of capitalism itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking while you were saying that the two theses, because I think there's like four or five total theses of ideology that Louis Althusser says in the ideological state apparatus work, is that one ideology is one's imaginary representation to reality.
Yeah.
You could see how like,
Real relations. Yeah.
yeah, on real relations, and in a way the imaginary is not just relating but and sort of displacing vis-a-vis like the like a spectacle, but also just like the actual image itself that social media brings. One relates to an image, especially with the social media influencers like in this manosphere. It's always the image of the man and how they ought to be and whether or not right now. And then that ideology has no history because everything that they're saying about the trad family and how a man ought to be is not related to anything in history at all, right? It's just all sort of like siloed in this sort of synchronic dimension.
Right. Yes. And I
Meaning
mean,
that like images and terminology and slogans can take on various meaning, right? But it has no sort of historical dimension to it. History is sort of effaced, a narrative is effaced. So like any meaning and delusional significance can come up.
right. So it's like if ideology is the imaginary representation of one's real conditions, real material conditions of existence, then the kind of like semiotic incoherence that these young men deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is dissolving the social bond for them and forcing them into a position where they have to construct this social bond for themselves. And this is where I think maybe some kind of generalized foreclosure might actually hold water. What it means is that, basically in simpler terms, everyone is born into a certain class position, and that this class position is defined by conditions, material conditions of production. So the division of labor is divided up based on production and the mode of production. Now, some people who have an issue with Marxism insofar as they think that it doesn't address the economic situation we're in right now, which is dominated by fictitious capital and investment in intangible objects, might say, well, when Althusser was writing about interpolation, he was dealing with a completely different, you know, um, confluence of forces here, and he seemed to assume that there is the possibility of fully identifying with the interpolation. That's an argument that we could have another time. But the point is, I think whether you are directly involved with the actual production of the commodities we need to consume to actually, survive and live, or whether or not we're talking about commodities which are purely fantastic and fictitious, nonetheless, there is something like a process of reproducing the world as we know it and reproducing the conditions that allow production to continue, even if those are changing all the time. The ideology is quite adroit at keeping a pace of those changing conditions. Now, we're all born into a certain class position based on the division of labor here. But ideology acts as a mediator that allows us to imagine our place in society and imagine the terrain of the S2 that we occupy, although that's becoming increasingly more difficult to, let's say, imagine or rise. It's increasingly more difficult to identify our place in even in the imaginary form that is superimposed over these real relations of production. Society must reproduce these conditions in order that capitalism continue to operate, even if it's always changing the parameters of its limits. However, I don't think that completely deflates Althusser. And I'll tell you why, because it's like we are nonetheless units of labor power to be exploited. And this is what the whole red pill thesis is trying to conceptualize in a sense. They're telling you as a young man that having a 9-to-5 kind of life is a miserable existence. And they're not wrong. In most cases, it's a pretty miserable existence because most jobs suck and are very demanding, and the wages that you receive in exchange for your labor are never sufficient, especially now that so many people have a certain image of a lifestyle dangled in front of their faces, men or women or whoever, that appears to be and is ultimately unattainable. So what happens is that there seems to be a short circuit here between the imaginary and the symbolic that precludes the possibility of ever forming a social bond. Well, I don't want to say precludes the possibility entirely, because then that would lead to a sort of philosophy of like absolute closure, but which definitely works against the formation of a social bond on the level of like class consciousness. So these men are vulnerable to the influences of someone who is addressing their suffering, which is a very real suffering and one that justifies redress in some sense, but also reifying the image that capitalism has given us of success, which is predicated on individual initiative and self-improvement and pulling oneself up by their bootstraps.
Yeah, and like you mentioned the way that this operates imaginarily and symbolically, but like the real is what has to be sort of uh pushed back and handled because it's so traumatic. And the real, as in the real conditions of capitalism, in the way that it produces a division of labor, it produces a class struggle, not just like sort of class positions, but an antagonism on who gets to enjoy the fruits of labor and who has to do all the labor and produce value, as well as the political factors that entail with the logic of capital. That those are the real conditions that must be concealed, and so ideology helps with that. And the real conditions are also structural by what Althusser talks about, base using Mark, a metaphor used in Marx, I think in like his preface for the critique of political economy. I think it's 1857 or 1856 or 1857, but he uses this like metaphor of base and superstructure. And so the base would be the economic constituents of a social formation. And you'll notice in that essay, he doesn't use the term society because he thinks the term society is idealistic and not a scientific notion. Marx uses social formation. Um, and then you have the superstructure, which is sort of the social relations and the institutions that help reproduce and maintain the base. And this ties in with the state and the ideological apparatus of the state, in which you have institutions that repress with violence, and then also that maintain the capitalist hegemony or the capitalist like mode of production with ideology, and that's like your schools, your churches, media outlets, and even social media is a media outlet. And why this is ideological, and there's such an ideological imprint in in these influencers, is because, like I said, they are representing things in an imaginized form, and then they also are conceiving these notions that have no history, and yet at the same time, the way that they handle the real antagonisms of male suffering, if that's such a thing, of like how these young boys are suffering, um, and how they need to improve themselves, is because they need to escape this matrix that's given to us by society and by the woke agenda, right? But what goes missing is the real concrete, what I just described and what you've been describing as well, is the capitalist social formation, which by the logic of capital not only has its own hierarchical structure with class, but it also like um creates a horizontalism of culture where we don't have this like medieval verticalism of like king, aristocracy, etc., etc., right? Culture is sort of horizontal, or like, to use the
Right.
term, rhizomat, right?
Yeah.
Here to use that term, but we'll just say it right now because it's the only thing I think of mine. But at the same time, the domination of capital, politically and structurally, still exists because there is still a dominant class on top. And it's funny because the only ones that are enjoying this lifestyle are not these young followers. They're trying to believe. The ones that are enjoying and profiting are these influencers who have some relationship to a capitalist class. Maybe they're not.
Directly. No,
Yeah,
but directly.
directly.
That's what's interesting because if we do live in this society of the spectacle, in a sense, and a lot of this is spectacular, what we're talking about in that imaginarized form, then what we saw with the election of Trump 2 is that these influencers had a direct and motive influence on his ascendancy again. That guy Sneeko I think he was one of the guys that interviewed Trump, and he was at the inauguration. And it's not any great surprise that all of these guys are Trumpers. But what's fascinating is that it's like they may have been responsible for at least a certain majority of his voters, or at least exposing him to Gen Z in a way that made him seem like the more viable option. But yeah, I was going somewhere with this. Yeah, what's fascinating is that like that Sneeko guy near the end, he's a little bit different than
Is that the Muslim dude, the one who identifies as a
Muslim
Muslim?
guy. Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of these guys, I think Andrew Tate did the same thing. They convert to Islam just to cap everything off with a nice, you know, um like, they just like kind of pull that out of their pocket last minute to just clean everything up. It's just like you convert to Islam or become very Christian to well, that doesn't matter. But what's interesting to me is that, Sneeko is the one that had the most to say about this Jewish slash satanic cabal that he imagines exists at the top, even though he does have some connection with the actual ruling class that is, pulling the levers of capitalism. So he really is involved in the deep state, the actual deep state, which isn't even so deep. It's like it's half on the surface. If there's like an iceberg theory, it's like you don't just have the submerged deep state and then the people that are acting as ventriloquist dummies on the top who are in plain sight. It's not that simple, but it's interesting that in order to maintain his own imaginarized ideological worldview, he has to fantasize the existence of a secret society which curdles at the pinnacle of this structure, only to explain away the glaringly obvious. So you don't have to even study Marx or Marxism or psychoanalysis to be aware of a mode of production and a division of labor, that define class, in a word, class, and the fact that the reality of class every day at every second makes itself known and impresses itself upon us in the most granular microscopic forms. But this is what must be disavowed in order to maintain this ideology.
Yeah, or it's appeared in a misrecognized form, like for instance, the classical, like the 99 versus the 1%, and that becomes sort of co-opted by these folks and this ideology because it perpetuates a conspiracy, specifically the Rothschilds and the Jews that control, they're the 1% that control 99 of the world's wealth, and here we are, this 99% that are submitted to them and their grand cabal. But this shows you that, this is an aspect of not only bourgeois ideology, but a certain aspect of the bourgeois class that's able to perpetuate an ideology, because we have to also remember, like this is not even in psychoanalytic terms, it's Marxist terms, but social fragmentation that happens in all forms of life in bourgeois society. And so like you will have these like typical bourgeois elites that like laissez-faire. They want things to be progressive. They want everybody to one day have their own business and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and monetize or create their own value. And then you have the parts of the bourgeois that are so like in despair and can't stand the movement of what's going on in society. So they wish for like a past that never was. They perpetuate these narratives of like masculinity or like a traditional world or some sort of like alt-right, so like it goes everywhere. But this is showing like the symptom of bourgeois subjectivity and how like it could even be itself reified in the commodity form and trickle down to the working class to use a Frederick Jameson term, distort their cognitive mapping, like to the cognitive mapping, like how one orients themselves in the world. This is like a form of cognitive mapping that they're trying to give like the working class or those that are men that are living 9 to 5 that aren't living to their potential, right? While hating women and blaming women and, gender ideology for their problems, when it's actually, no, you're just a symptom of, bourgeois society, of bourgeois fragmentation.
Yeah, and it would be much easier for these men to find a quilting point in the counterpart to their isolation, which they identify as, the woman who is showered with gifts simply based on her body and the way she presents herself. And there is this also kind of like horror of femininity here, which I don't think I fully thought through any of this, but there is something here where there's like a kind of short circuit between what we've been saying about sexuation and this social technical division of labor, and the way, to approach the other and to accept one's role in its passivity. I mean, to be castrated is to be made passive in a sense. Maybe you're given a share of in potency, in the promise of some kind of force in abeyance that you participate in, and that once united brothers in arms, so to speak, the nation, the call to serve the nation was
Yeah.
enough to confer a kind of identity upon you. But now, especially now with like what's going on with Iran, it's like nobody believes in that anymore. Nobody believes in the summons of the nation or the fatherland or the motherland or the state. You have to resort to a kind of ironizing position. And these influencer guys that we're talking about, I don't think they even fully grasp how much irony plays into their own dictates, or how much they have almost an ironic distance from who they are.
Yeah, and it's funny how like they have this distance. They sell their own life as a brand, and yet they would never promote this lifestyle to anyone or have anybody wish to follow them. But it's like, wait, everything that you're doing dictates on being followed, and you want people to purchase this brand and even try to say like, oh, this is how I want you to be as a man, or how you ought to be, because society wants to turn you into like transgender ideology or something like that.
But then they would be the primal horde that would end up killing them.
Well,
That's the ironic thing.
right, right, exactly. So it's just like it is an ironic lifestyle that they're kind of um embodying and also disavowing, right? Um,
Yeah.
and I guess like that's like, you don't even have to get psychoanalytic about it. This is like the disavowal, and I think this is where we could go to your last point, because I think we should wrap it up soon. To your last
Yeah, I
point
just had
about
one
the
one more
prescription.
topic I wanted to hit on, which is
Yeah,
Louis'
yeah, and I think this
wisdom.
ties in because this is the nature of the bourgeois subject, is to disavow their position in class, right? And I think to the last part, Louis reifies this because he only sees it as like a product of society in which these specific males grew up in an internet culture. And
Wait,
so,
can you hold that thought? I'm
yeah,
just gonna get another drink. I'll be right
yeah,
back.
I'll pause it real quick. Yeah, so like to this last point, because it's addressed to Louis Theroux's prescriptions, and he uses this term society, and it's like the typical thing. Well, society, does this and that, just like them, right? And from what I took, I know you had some ideas on this as well. That like these are a specific group of men that are victims of a certain point in society that is dictated by social media influence culture, like internet culture. Like they were raised on the internet, and I think for me, like that kind of reifies the fact that it's just a few men, and he can't even conceive not only the ideological relation but the class relation, because he only sees it in terms of like social media culture, right? Well, what is social media but a media that's part of technology? But technology, again, is not some sort of acephalic thing or like something that is just like its own like substance or God, that it still operates within the productive forces of capitalism and the relationship of production. That you know technology, of course, has existed prior to capitalism in many forms, like glasses and binoculars and telescopes, right? But like the way capitalism appropriates technology and even the internet is something radically new, because technology used to be a part of science. Now, and this comes from like Lacan, like technology has become its own alethosphere, which is not aligned with discovery of knowledge through science, but rather through capitalist production, right? And those forces of production and the labor that constitutes the driving force of technology and how that affects the social. And so like this is where like that kind of gets left out, because it's only this critique of like a few good men or a few bad men that like need therapy.
Right. And it's not as if I would expect Louis Theroux to have a nice classical materialist critique of what's going on here in this hour and a half Netflix documentary. I mean, he's not a Marxist or into psychoanalysis exactly, but I'm thinking of his responses to this influencer ideology and his sort of like counter ideology from the lens of like does what does his critique have to say about the kind of like bourgeois liberalism and that worldview which he's coming from? Well, there's a very revealing moment when he's talking to HS and he says to him like something like, why don't you just be like a good person? Like, why isn't it enough to just be a good person? And HS says something very obvious, but honestly, it's like a good counterpoint to what he's saying, where he's like, well, because I realize when I do, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, he doesn't say this, but when I do like horrendous things and say horrendous things like, you know, I hate all Jews or whatever, or mess with people in the street or go chat up birds, around Spain, that I get more views. So why would I be a good person that's not going to pay? Now that seems very obvious, but it's like, in a sense, it's like, yeah, why would you be a good person? You know, and I think that having seen other Louis Theroux documentaries where, like I was saying before, he's able to expose the absurdity of people's ideology simply by allowing them to speak and giving light pushback. In this case, he wasn't prepared for someone who is streaming 24/7 and is arguing for their ridiculous ideology all the time and always crafting talking points, not in any kind of like dialectical way, but just in a way that is articulate. And by articulate, I don't mean intelligent, but just able to put into words what they do in a way that for their followers is effective. What he has to offer in response is a kind of like bland humanism of like, what's wrong with being a good person? Why not just embrace the sentiment that you are enough and realize that your choices are ultimately informed by an avoidance of trauma, right? So he breaks it down into an acknowledgement of trauma that these influencers are going to lengths to avoid. And I think of this trauma word as a kind of like deus ex machina, in the sense that it ultimately slathers all of the material with a kind of like psychologizing humanist um, value system that is based on civility and decency. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with civility and decency necessarily, but like you can't really stand that up against what all of these people and their followers are symptoms of, in a sense. And that's why, to me, just to sum it up, the documentary doesn't really work. It doesn't work from the point of view of like, well, one, you're giving these people a platform and more exposure. And that's why they're doing the documentary, because they know they'll get more exposure. The people that are following them, who are already convinced of their greatness, aren't going to be unconvinced by a Louis Theroux. And the people, but the majority of people, I hope is the case, who find these people to be deplorable are going to continue to believe or be all the more convinced that they're deplorable. But it just shows that he doesn't have a counter argument to what it is they're doing and what they represent. Because, well, one, there's like a personalization where it's like, these guys are the worst of the worst. And yeah, they are. But by holding the worst of the worst up to public view, you are not actually contributing to the dismantling of this ideology. As we can see with everything that's happening with the Trump administration, the Epstein files, yes, like they are losing MAGA supporters all the time. I'm not saying that the recent news events aren't losing people. They are. But whether Trump, survives the next few years, whether he's impeached or not, whether these people become passe, whether the influencer dreams that are sold disappear, fade away, or replaced by something else, it doesn't really matter, because neither Louis Theroux nor any of the, proponents of a kind of like I'm calling it kind of like bland humanism that ultimately ratifies and embraces the capitalist mode of production that we live in, whether it prevails or not, it doesn't really matter, because it is simply, I said the inverse before, but it's not even, I won't even dignify it by calling it the inverse of the Manosphere red pill ideology. It's just another layer of it. You know what I mean? And it's more ideology, and it isn't a counter ideology. And that's where I think the weakness of the supposed objectivity of Louis Theroux's like journalistic approach to this material actually falters.
In a sense, we see how Janus faced the ideology can be, not just the social fragmentation of the bourgeois as well as the working class, like I explained, but just the Janus face aspect of how the ideology can talk to one another, right? Even if Thoreau is appalled by these people and what they represent, what he fails to see is how symptomatic they are and how they kind of, in a sense, express the truth of how capitalist ideology can express its excess, right? Um, and conform to that logic of capital, right?
Yeah. And I think the last scene during the credits, it shows him like hitting the punching bag.
Mm-hmm.
They were making fun of him earlier for getting a low score and, trying to emasculate him throughout that entire sequence where he's hanging out with HS. And it's kind of like he showed this scene near the end where he actually gets like a pretty high score on the punching bag. And it was as if to underline the fact that, like, well, one, like, nah, I don't care about any of these feats of masculinity, all this shit is stupid, but also like, look, I did get like a pretty high score, so I can punch, you know, simultaneously. And it kind of shows that whether you profess to remain apart and outside of the ideology that's being pushed here, in some way, like, you're drawn into it. And the only way to really pierce this ideology and really, like, because I'd rather people not follow these guys. I do find it sickening, but you need to kind of like attack it from within. And that's the only way out of it. Because right now, the scary thing is there isn't a strong counter ideology to affect a sort of like resistance to the interpolation that's going on right now. Or if there is, I don't know if it's a counter ideology, but yes, not everybody falls into the manosphere trap. Most people don't, but it's not whether they do or don't. This is just the most extreme sort of apotheosis of what is the norm.